So what would you say if I told you that you could get a $16 to $20 IEM with 3 sets of tuning filters, an aluminium faceplate and a detachable cable? Let's find out. What's cracking, audio fans? It's David here from Prime Audio Reviews, and I'm here today with the TRN STM. Now this is a dual driver hybrid unit. It's got one dynamic driver and one balanced armature driver. And yes, the big feature, well, supposedly the big feature with this is the tuning nozzles, but I'm not so sure about that. Let's take a closer look. So here's the box. There's nothing special about there. It is very, very KZ-esque. In fact, let me just show you something. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that KZ and TRN bought or acquired their packaging from the same factory, because you can see these are pretty much identical except for the, the images on them. But that's besides the point, because I'm here to talk about the STM. Now, oh, what is that? It might be something that's coming up soon. The little shut up. Coming soon. All right, let's have a look now at the STM. So as always, let's come in for a closer look. Okay, so here it is. Aluminium alloy faceplate. It's got the little star design there. You can see here it's got the Type-C 2-pin connectors. And here is the nozzle, and these are actually also the tuning filters. So this is the default one. This is what they call balanced, and it just screws off, simple as that. And in the box you get 3 sets. You also get blue filters and red filters. Now the red ones slightly enhance the bass, and the blue ones lift the treble somewhat. And the effect that the nozzles have is pretty minimum. I will show it in a graph. Actually, let's do that here. So you can see the difference that the nozzles make is very minimal, but you can actually hear it. But for my preference, I like the gold ones, the default ones, and that's what we're going to go with today. So when I'm talking about the sound, I'm talking about the sound with the gold filter. They're really nicely machined. They just go on perfectly threaded, not like those old early Trinity Audio filter systems that were a nightmare. Trinity Audio Master, if I remember correctly, or the Phantom 4. Right. So you got a typical acrylic transparent shell here. You can see the dynamic driver there, and the other balanced armature driver is visible just here in the nozzle. So in terms of fit and comfort, these are actually really good. They fit me quite well. Fairly standard. They're quite similar to the KZ ZST shell or the KB Ear KS2 shell. We'll cover those a little bit later on. So yeah, that's about it for the physical build. They're extremely lightweight. They're comfortable. They look and feel quite well built. Keep in mind, this is, like, I've seen these online for as low as $16, I think, and up to 20 or 22, something like that. But for that price, you're getting a good shell at the very least. I almost forgot to talk about the cable, but I'll just be real quick with this because it's basically your standard budget TRN. It's basically the same as the old KZ brown cables. You've got preformed ear guides here, transparent 2-pin connectors, the Type-C with the hood on them, right angled 3.5mm termination. The cable is braided. It handles reasonably well. It is a tangly little bastard, so you'll spend a lot of time untangling it. So in my opinion, it might be worth upgrading unless you're really strapped for cash. If you are really strapped for cash or on a very tight budget, this cable's fine. The only thing is it does tangle a lot. So let's get that out of the way. All right, and now it's time to talk about how these sound. And as I mentioned, the filters do make a very subtle change. It's not very much, but I prefer to stick with the gold filter, and it also looks pretty cool. But let's break down the sound. Basically, what you get with the STM here, it has a very clean sound. It's rather linear. It's a kind of light and spacious sound. And I tell you what, for the price, I reckon it is pretty darn impressive. Now, you might see some other reviewers giving these a hard time, and to that I say, fuck off. Because, I mean, keep in mind, like I always say with these ultra budget IMs, you got to keep the review in the context of the low price. Now, of course, these are not going to have end game qualities or technical features, technical ability. It is just a budget everyday person's IM, and that's the way I review these cheap earphones. So with that said, let's break it down, starting with the bass. And the bass is quite interesting on these. It is a full-bodied bass. It's got plenty of warmth, and it has a good thickness to the notes. It has a decent amount of impact. It's not a real punchy one. And it kind of sounds like a big bass, but in reality, it is actually quite light in terms of forwardness or the level of the bass. It is relatively tame, and surprisingly, it is fairly good in terms of quality as well. Like it's not overblown. It's very light. It's quite tidy. It does have a sort of extended decay time, which adds to its weight, but the attack on it is pretty fast. It is a reasonably fast overall bass, but like I said, it doesn't really have a lot of punch or impact, but it does extend fairly well, and you do get a nice sub-bass rumble from it, but it's a fairly light and smooth kind of sub-bass rumble. It's not one that really shakes around and gives you that deep-seated, rumble. But at the same time, I find it quite ample, and I haven't found it lacking in any of my, classic hip-hop tracks or jazz where you want to hear that double bass, or EDM when you want to hear those big synthetic bass lines. And yeah, for considering the price, I think the bass is actually pretty good. Which leads me on to the mid-range. Now, like I said, the signature is fairly linear. Let's throw up the graph just here. It is rather interesting considering the fullness of the bass. That doesn't really carry over much into the mid-range. The mids are quite neutral. They're very clean sounding. The note size is kind of neutral, and the tone of the mids is fairly neutral. And what you get is this very spacious, very light and airy sound. There is a lot of sort of clean air in empty spaces around the soundstage. And yet at the same time, the mid-range doesn't really sound anemic. Like, I do prefer usually a little bit more fullness in the lower mid-range, but it didn't really bother me here. I mean, male vocals still sound good. Female vocals do get lifted a bit more, and they sound really nice as well. But it's just a very kind of mature tuning for the mid-range. It's sort of pristine clean, it's light, a little bit diffuse, but at the same time it's not lacking in density. Like you still get a solid sort of center image, and it's not all wishy-washy, but it's just a very, very interesting mid-range. And it's also interesting how it transitions from that kind of full warm bass into this really neutral mid-range without much sort of bass bleeding over and without much warmth in the lower mids. It's just a very interesting sound. And So let's finally talk about the treble now. And you know what? The treble is fairly safe in terms of tuning. It's a non-fatiguing treble. The treble notes are kind of rounded and a little bit soft, but still fairly crisp, and they sound natural. Like a lot of budget balanced armature trebles, it doesn't have that sort of harsh metallic edge to it that you get from a lot of budget gear, like the ZSTX here, or ZXTX, in case that guy, if you're watching, the ZSTX with me full Australian accent, has a more forward treble, but it sounds a little bit artificial. It does have a kind of metallic sheen to it. These don't have that. The STM here it's actually a really good treble, and it's one of the best trebles, in my opinion, that I've heard on a TRN earphone so far. Even better than some of their higher end models, because TRN generally tunes their treble to be fairly forward, quite energetic, precise, but at the same time at least bordering or well into that sibilant range, and it can be fatiguing in most cases. But this is the first one I've heard that doesn't really do that so much. So I like the treble tuning on these, which leads me now to the next section. I'll do a couple of real quick comparisons here, starting with the ZSTX. Now the ZSTX, or the ZSTX, has more of a V-shaped signature. It's got a more elevated bass, so it's definitely got a more punchy bass, a little bit more savage sub-bass rumble, and which gives it a bit extra warmth and thickness down low. The mid-range is more recessed comparatively. Actually, the mid-ranges on both of these IEMs do have similarities. They're both kind of neutral weighted, but because the ZSTX is in that V valley, it sounds a bit more recessed by comparison. And the treble, like I mentioned before, the treble on the ZSTX is more forward. It is more energetic and lively, which some people love, but it does have a kind of a little artificial edge to it, a little bit of harshness to it as well. But overall, it's still a great IEM, especially considering its low price, which when I reviewed it was $16. It might even be less now, but it's still a worthwhile IEM for beginners. And now the KBER KS2, and again, the KS2 is a little bit more V-shaped than the STM. It has extra elevation in the bass and the treble. But the difference with the KS2 here is the mids don't really sound as recessed as they do on the ZSX or ZSX. Elevated bass, nice and punchy, great sub-bass rumble. Mid-range, yes, it is slightly recessed, but maybe you could call it a more of a W-shaped signature, because the vocals don't really sound that recessed to me. And anyway, V-shaped is where it's at. If you get things too linear, it just ends up sounding fucking flat and boring and dull. So I do like a bit of a V-shape myself, and these do that really well. And the main difference between the KS2 and the ZSX here, ZSTX, is the quality of the treble, which on the KS2 is kind of similar to the STM here. Slightly rounded, very pleasing, non-fatiguing, but still crisp enough, still got some precision there, and still reveals a good amount of detail. So out of these, what do I prefer? That's a tough question, because I actually really like the sound of the STM here. It is a very mature sounding IEM for something in its price range. It's just a kind of sound that you don't hear very often in a $20 or sub $20 IEM. And on some music, it just sounds absolutely brilliant. I will say one thing before I forget, or that I did forget, is when you turn the volume up loud, the upper mids do get a little bit edgy sometimes. And I wouldn't say there's really inherent sibilance in these earphones, but on some tracks, particularly sort of grungy rock tracks with electric guitars and crash cymbals, it can get a little bit bright, and that borders on being uneasy for me. But for the most part, I find these actually really good. And I even enjoyed some good classical music with these, which surprised me quite a bit. But I've pretty much listened to every different kind of genre that I normally listen to, and I found them to be rather pleasing. It won't be for everybody. Definitely not if you're a bass head. Definitely not if you're an audiophile who's used to high quality gear. Don't waste your fucking time on this budget stuff. But if you are someone who's looking for an upgrade from the earbuds that came with your phone or whatever, or you're just looking for a cheap replacement, you're looking for a slight upgrade or an alternative to your ZSTX, then I recommend the TRN STM. I think these are a very good earphone. I love the filter option, even though the change is very subtle. It's great to have, and it's a little fun feature. The build quality, everything is good. So yeah, definitely recommended, and check these out. As always, there is a link to the written review in the description below. There's also links to all my media channels and my Discord, so go ahead and check those out. And that's about it for this video, guys. So give it a thumbs up, Parfam audiophile style. And if you are new to the channel and want to see more reviews like this and this in the future, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you later.